The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Now large crowds were traveling with him, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not at first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." Wow. The gospel of the Lord. It's quite a passage. Sometimes the passage is called the cost of discipleship. Okay. Um, Demands of discipleship, maybe, or the sacrifice of discipleship. It's a passage, pardon me. It is a passage that stands out for its really uncompromising demand for discipleship. In these verses, Jesus addresses the crowds who are following after him, and he kind of gives them this stark assessment of what following him will entail. Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me, be my disciple, cannot be my disciple. Well, of course, Luke is writing this 40 years after the event. And so the cross in Jesus' own time was not that much of a symbol. It became a symbol. And maybe Jesus was speaking prophetically, knowing what would befall him. Still, the use of the cross as a symbol of following Christ had not been introduced before. He then uses two parables, the tower builder and the king ready to go to war, to illustrate the necessity of counting the cost before embarking on discipleship. This passage culminates with the assertion that none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. He was speaking rather specifically to those who were standing there. He wasn't telling you that you have to give away everything you've got and become a monk, or now maybe, I mean, I would like to believe that all the monastics have truly given up everything in order to follow Christ the way they deem necessary. But not everybody is called to do that. Or rather, I think in our time, we may have ownership of possessions, but they cannot have ownership over us. So we approach this passage, Luke 14, from a historical critical perspective, as I always do, we're going to look at the literary, the historical, the theological context of this small passage. Incidentally, there's a nice word that we use for these episodes. They're called pericopes. The word looks like pericope, but pericope, this small little section here. And looking at the probable setting in life, here's another great word, a German phrase, Sitzenleben. It's situation in life. And look at some of the characteristics that have been edited into and out of maybe the text. But we're going to look at the import of this within the wider Christian movement. Okay, Luke 14, this section, 25 through 33, is situated inside Luke's what they call the travel narrative, which actually begins in chapter 9 and concludes in chapter 19. It's a central section of the gospel where Jesus is portrayed as traveling towards Jerusalem, teaching about discipleship, teaching about the kingdom of God. And this passage directly follows his teaching about humility and inclusion and precedes his parables about lostness and redemption. This small chunk, this pericope, is marked by a series of stark statements and illustrative parables. Again, like we've talked about before, Luke is approaching it artistically, like having what in art they called a diptych, where you have two panels that can face each other that may show very contrasting situations. This passage divides very neatly into three parts, a triptych. That art that was used by, who did it? Hieronymus Bosch, I think, where you would see three panels that had three different scenes of a passage. The first of the three scenarios, or the three divisions, are verses 25 through 27, which are the radical demands of discipleship, focusing on the renunciation of family, even renouncing self-preservation. Verses 28 through 32 are kind of they're exhortations of counting the cost before following Jesus, with the examples of the builder and the king. And then verse 33, the final verse, is the summary demand of renouncing all possessions. Luke's editing shapes these teachings into this sustained call for commitment, and it aligns with Luke's theological accent on the costliness and the urgency of the kingdom of God. Now, the Gospel of Luke is usually dated late in the first century, somewhere between 75 and 80. Some will put it as late as the year 90. I don't think so. But it was composed in the aftermath of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. That took place in the year 70. And also in the middle of growing tensions between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, as well as increasing separation from the synagogue that the early Christians were feeling. Luke's audience was likely a mixed community. Maybe they were urban, with both Jewish and Gentile elements. They were facing issues of wealth, status, and the cost of belonging to a countercultural movement. The sayings in our Luke passage really reflect the radicalism of Jesus' call in the context of first century Palestinian Judaism. This is where loyalty to family was a primary social virtue and of social value. The language of hating one's family. Oh my goodness. We should read that as a kind of a Semitic idiom, a Jewish idiom, signifying preference or priority, not literal animosity. It's simply a you should want to follow Christ so much that in comparison you hate family. Still, the language is shocking. It's not literal animosity. In a society built upon extended kinship and the networks that are involved, Jesus' demand for allegiance above kin would be perceived as radical, maybe even subversive. Of course, carrying the cross, verse 27, like I said, it's a metaphor that's drawn from Roman execution. This form of punishment that was reserved for the lowest classes and rebels. One who is crucified was guilty of sedition against the state, which is why the two what have been called historically or lazily thieves who hung on either side. They weren't thieves. They weren't out stealing a loaf of bread. These were rebels. For Luke's audience, especially after the year 70 and the destruction of the temple, this figure evoked not only the story of Jesus' crucifixion, but also the possibility of suffering, exclusion, marginalization that Christians face within their own social context. There's a parallel passage. Pardon me. There's a parallel passage in Matthew 10, verses 37 through 38. It contains similar language. In Matthew, it says, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And that suggests a common source. It's usually attributed to a source we call the Q document. Q simply coming from the German word Quelle, which means source. So this source document. But Luke's version is even more radical in its rhetoric, using hate instead of Matthew's love more than me. Luke's editing hand is evident in the intense demand and the inclusion of the parables that were unique to Luke's account. The tower builder and the king are found only in Luke. And this served his characteristic interests in wise decision making and the dangers of unconsidered enthusiasm. Luke weaves these sayings to fit his overall theme: discipleship is not to be entered lightly, because it may require everything. Nearer to our own time, we can think of somebody like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It cost him everything to be a disciple. He was marginalized, he was excluded, he was criminalized, and he was executed. It wasn't just the first century who suffered that. We think about Father Maximilian Kolbe, the Polish priest, who gave up his life for another. It required him everything. Jesus' demands reflect the radical nature of his movement within the first century in Galilee. A context that was marked by poverty, by social inequality, and frankly, by political instability. The hating of family has to be understood against the backdrop of loyalty conflicts, where Jesus, following Jesus, could mean social ostracism, exclusion, economic loss. The command to carry the cross speaks to the very real possibility of persecution faced by Jesus' followers. And for Luke's later audience, these sayings took on a new significance. As Christianity spread, many converts faced tension inside their own family. I've seen it now in our own time where people were thrown out of the family because they had become Christian. I've seen it in India and in Japan, other places. People were actually thrown out of the family. Well, these words from Luke gave some assurance and reassurance. Not necessarily comfort, except to know that they were acting as a disciple. The call to give up possessions kind of resonated with issues of wealth and sharing of command or power. And this was a theme that really was prominent in both Luke and Acts, the two volumes. Now, the Greek text uses strong imperatives, hyperbolic or exaggerated language. The term to hate is best interpreted as an idiom, really meaning to love less or to detach from. It was really a common Semitic expression. Luke's rhetorical style is forceful, and it presses the reader to or hearer to consider the seriousness of the call. The parables employ practical wisdom, which was a hallmark of Luke's narrative style, inviting the audience to reflect on everyday realities like construction or warfare. And these Luke uses as analogies for the spiritual and, well, frankly, existential commitment that's required. The passage serves a critical theological function in Luke. First, it underlines the total claim of Jesus upon his followers. Allegiance to Jesus must supersede all other claims, even those of family, self, possessions. And this focus mirrors Luke's consistent emphasis on the reversal of values. Think about the Magnificat or the Beatitudes in Luke, and the dangers of wealth spoken of in Luke chapter 12 and again in Luke chapter 16. And second, the passage challenges would-be disciples to soberly consider the cost of following Jesus. The call is inclusive, but the commitment is absolute. The journey to Jerusalem, this travel narrative, symbolizes the costly path of the cross. Third, the passage prepares the early Christian community for the trials they were going to face by framing discipleship as a radical break from conventional commitments. And Luke offers both a warning to the complacent and those who were, well, lukewarm. Oh, sorry, that sounded like a pun. Didn't mean lukewarm, you know what I mean. But he also offers encouragement to those who were suffering loss or even persecution. The whole setting in life, that word I used before, that phrase I used before, Sitzemleben, the situation in life of this tradition probably reflects the heightened tension that was going on in the early church. Moments when following Jesus entailed real cost, existential cost. This could include the break with the synagogue, family estrangement, or even economic exclusion or marginalization. The stress on possessions and family indicates the struggles of Christians negotiating their new identity in a hostile or at best indifferent environment. Throughout church history, Luke 14:25 through 33, our pericope, has been interpreted both literally and figuratively. Monastic and ascetic traditions read these words as the call to poverty and detachments. Fair enough. I never felt called to poverty or detachment. Others have stressed the primacy of commitment, seeing hate as an exaggeration, calling for loyalty. Modern interpreters, in our own time, wrestle with the harshness of this passage. We try to balance the demands of the gospel's broader message of love and reconciliation. And yet, most agree that Luke intends to shock the reader into recognizing the all-inclusive, all-encompassing nature of discipleship. Our passage, in its literary, historical, and theological dimensions, offers a profound meditation on the cost of discipleship. The passage's radical rhetoric is rooted in both the ministry of Jesus and in the lived reality of the early church. Luke's editing and structure clarifies the necessity of total commitment. And that total commitment may disrupt family. It may lose possessions and even one's own self-interests. In this narrative, Luke not only preserves the memory of Jesus' challenge, but also shapes the identity of the Christian movement, calling all who would follow to count the cost and to embrace the journey of the cross. We think about that today, and there is a cost to be a disciple. There's a great cost. It costs friends sometimes. It may cost family, even in our time, as I mentioned, in other places. It may cost business relationships. In saying, no, I won't go off and do this with you. I won't, do what the good old boys club wants to do. That can cost business relationships. I've seen that happen too. And even now, across the millennia, Luke is focusing on Jesus' words that discipleship just may cost you everything. Like Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, it's costly because it requires everything. It's grace because it's Jesus who calls us to do it. Costly grace. Thanks be to God.